Hi, Zizaran here with another episode of PoE University, and today, why build? We're going to talk about making builds, explaining why, and a little bit more generic stuff. So it's a bit of a hard thing. We have a lot of bullet points. I'm probably going to go through those first and talk a little about it, and then I am going to go through go through the path of building for my build and explain like what makes it a good build. Because as a new player, it's very hard to see what is a good build, why is it a good build, and why is it so bad when you as a new player try to make one, because it's very rough in PoE. And we end up always having very solid builds for the past few years now. I think in the last 7 years of build creation, I've only published one bad build, and we learned a lot from that. So let's try to explain some of why and how that works. So first, you want to figure out the goals for the build, right? And that can be, for example, you'll have a very, very different goal in mind when it's your first build for the league, or whether it's like your 10th build for the league if you play that much, right? So league starters are very specific. And you also want to think, is this something, do I need specific uniques? Do I need a very specific influenced item? Or do I need nothing? I can just pick up rares from the ground. And then, is this the playstyle that's right for me? Like, yeah, Zizaran's explosive arrow totems looks really good, but do I like totems? Do I like delayed damage? How many other people are going to be competing for the gear, right? Because if this is the case, so for example, explosive arrow or something like that, where it's super SSF viable, then it actually doesn't matter. Even if everything's gear is really expensive, I don't even have to buy stuff because it's so easy to gear myself. So it doesn't matter that it's expensive. But sometimes, let's say that you need a specific jewel or something that is quite rare and a lot of people want it, man, then it's going to be expensive. So that's like the double whammy. Is it rare and used in a popular build? Probably not going to be able to afford it. And then there's a lot of questions that, are totems minions? Why are we taking minion damage nodes, etc.? Is there any secret technology? Is there anything complicated in the build for like that might be hard to understand? And is this something new, or are we just reinventing something that is already done? Are we following somebody else that have already come up with an idea? Like, surely Sai is a very, very safe person to follow. He would never put out a bad explosive arrow build that would ruin everyone's league, and Zizaran will tell everybody to follow it for a terrible experience. That's only going to happen once every 7 years. So, you want to figure out who you're going to follow builds from and stuff, and how they react for if they do put out something bad. Yes, we did make one bad guide for explosive arrow one time. We learned a lot. And then, yeah, some people really like, for example, dots and things like, and for those that don't know, Sai is the guy we make builds together. So he helps me every single league start. I can't remember what league it was, but it was bad. We learned a lot from it. We can talk about that later. So yeah, some people like things like Essence Train with Contagion, but maybe that doesn't have enough single target. Maybe has really good AoE, but you want to figure out what's the build good at. Do you need it to do mapping, or do you only need it for bossing? I remember I had one build that literally couldn't map. It would probably take 5 to 10 minutes per map because it was skeletons with no melee splash. It was hard for me to swap, but it was immortal to Awakener, never ended up dying. I could stand still in everything. There was nothing that could kill me. And I had like okay damage. So I could literally go AFK. And that was really cool. So you end up having to compromise. And then, is it just a really good mapping build? Is it like something that like, oh, you don't need to read map mods. It's immune to reflect. Can be really important. Is it going to be squishy? Do I have to play well? Because there are some builds, and this is especially viable on softcore. Path of Exile is so telegraphed that you can run around monsters, even at low level. If you know how the monsters are firing, you can run around them. And as long as you know their attack patterns, it's very easy to avoid a lot of monsters. Unlike Diablo 4 was a little strange with this because auto attacks were so unavoidable. Whereas in Path of Exile, everything is generally so clearly telegraphed unless your screen is completely fucked by crazy effects that you can run around and outplay it that way. Is it safe for boss mechanics? There are some builds that I'll make that are completely face tank even for in-game bosses. And then there'll be some where it's, yeah, you have to just play really well. Like the Impending Doom that you saw a lot of people do. Both Gucci and me and a few others played it. And You had people like Steelmage made a basically immortal version. The version I was playing was very squishy, but it even slowed the boss. So even though I had a lot of damage, and even though I was very squishy, I could just outplay the boss. Everything the boss do would one-hit me, but I could just not get hit by it. And then freedom of movement and how like good does the build play? Like for example, the number one important thing to almost fit in every single build is phasing. Phasing is when you can run through monsters, because like I said, in Path of Exile, every attack is very telegraphed, but if you run into a bunch of monsters, they're boxing you in, they all get to hit you, and even white auto attacks from normal monsters is going to do a lot of damage. And then, is there a rhythm to the build? Like, is there multiple abilities? What if it's 3 abilities? Do you want to do that? What if I have to, like, throw down a buff, then spawn corpses, then they used as an attack like Volatile Dead, and then I have to wait for that to hit? That's a lot of stages for my damage to hit. So... And there are some builds that are just annoying to play, right? We've done some more advanced builds with like weapon swapping back and forth, and it can just end up feeling really bad. Sometimes there'll be too many buttons, even for really strong builds. Pretty recently, a build called the Impaler was incredibly strong. It could almost one-shot bosses, but you would have to do 4 shouts before every attack or before every 3 attacks to go like rallying cry, intimidating shout, another shout, boom. And then suck, boom, suck, and the boss would die. But a lot of people hated that build because there was so much micromanagement, and sometimes you would use the shout, etc. So all of those things are really important to keep in mind when you're looking for a build or when you're creating a build. And also just a complex rotation. Sometimes what a lot of people are asking for is, man, I just want a build that's cheap, only has 1 button, is really tanky and insane damage. It's like, man, okay, you're asking a little bit much here. And then you have to figure out, especially if you're on hardcore, how do I get both damage and tank? And PoE is in a pretty good state right now, in a way, because damage ends up being your tank on softcore. So you end up not having to compromise as much, and you end up compromising on your tank instead. Because if the boss dies, like the faster we kill, the faster they die. And if the boss isn't there, it can't kill you. And you do want to think about your tank. You're like, well, okay, I really want spell suppression. And some of these might change with the upcoming patch notes because, you know, we would like that. We would like to have more defensive options and be less pigeonholed into spell suppression, which this thing we actually were a little bit less pigeonholed into spell suppression than normal. But we'll see. And then how many auras can I fit? Can I afford to do any damage auras? Or do I have to pick a skill that doesn't need auras or scaling? Part of why things like Detonate Dead has been so strong, or Herald of Agony years ago, etc., was that it needed very little damage to actually kill bosses, and you could instead focus on a tank. Am I passing by any tank nodes that I can pick up? Champion's a really tanky class, and you see on hardcore, Champion, Juggernaut, Necromancer, Saboteur end up being very, very powerful classes because they get a lot of tank from their ascendancy. And then, do we need defensive curses? And Feeble, Temporal Chains. Temporal Chains is now an offensive and defensive curse because of poison, so it's incredibly strong. That's a big change that we are expecting later today. And then, do we have enough sockets for a cast when damage taken setup? Like something like cast when damage taken Molten Shell can be incredibly strong. Like, yeah, you just took 2,000 damage. Here is a shield for 6,000 damage, so that you're less likely to get bursted down. And what about swapping? A good example of this is I would swap out Grace for bosses and put in Malevolence, because obviously Grace and the boss's auto attacks not hitting me that much was not very important for my champion. But getting like a 50-60% more damage boost from Malevolence would be a huge defensive aura for bosses, right? And what I mean by defensive aura is that I'm going to kill the boss so much faster that it doesn't have time to whittle me down. And yeah, you don't want too many swaps either, right? Like having 1 gem swap or something, that's fine. But yeah. So what about damage? 100% more damage per arrow? That's 4,000 damage with more other multipliers. And you want to like, Path of Exile at the endgame ends up being Path of multipliers, right? And thankfully they managed to contain the power creep where, you know, back in the day, I remember having 250,000 DPS, and that was really good damage per second for bosses. Now we do see most people's builds that we end up recommending end up being between 1 to 6 million, with the higher end being like 10 million. But you do still see like crazy optimized builds, especially if it's just to be optimized on paper. People are already hitting billions of damage, but most people don't see that. And I would say most builds at the moment ends up being good builds, but with around 2 to 5 million damage per second. Then you have to think about, am I going to go hit based? Am I going to go ignite based? Well, maybe if I'm ignite based, it's really nice that I can hit the boss once and then focus on dodging and running around. Or something like Stormbrand, well, yeah, it might do a lot less damage than other builds, but I have a lot more freedom to actually move around. And something that's not talked about enough is damage uptime. And by that I mean, let's say that Seismic Trap might do 3 million DPS, but it's 3 million DPS while the boss is inside those charges going up. So if, let's say, Stormrun has 1.5 million DPS, but it is always up all the time, then 1.5 million DPS can be more effective damage than 3 million. And we saw a lot of this where people were complaining about Seismic Trap being too OP. It was too OP for some bosses, and especially the invitations, where it's very easy to force the boss to heal. Whereas builds like Cold Dot, where it's really easy to keep the damage applied on the boss all the time, we actually saw that that was out DPSing what people consider the most OP build, Seismic, because the damage was always there. So if the boss is teleporting off, you throw down your 4 Seismic charges, and the boss teleports off, then your 20 damage you were about to deliver is suddenly very little. None. Maybe you only got off 10% of that damage. So that's why sometimes I would like recommend builds for like, okay, this is really good for invitations. It's really good for mapping and map bosses. However, it's bad for Maven. It's bad for Cyrus, etc. So important to keep in mind. And then you have things like Skitterbots ending up being a damage increase for pretty much every build that doesn't already shock itself or chill itself. And Skitterbots also enables you to use Hypothermia for any build in the game, right? If you don't know what the Hypothermia gem does, it's something like up to 25 now or 29 damage against chilled targets. But if you have Skitterbots, everything is always a chilled target. Another example is Explosive Arrow. Explosive Arrow is very, very hard to calculate, and we'll open Path of Building for this. Because what a lot of people would do while following my build guide is they will slap this to 20, right? And they will see that they have a total dot DPS of 3.4 million, and they'll be like, man, this is great. But they might not necessarily see the difference. This is a third-party program that's very useful. We have a few guides for this program too. So let's see here, right? They haven't calculated the difference of the attack speed, for example, and that's very important for this build. So let's look at these two bows, right? The only difference is this second one doesn't have attack speed. You see, the damage barely changes. It barely changes at all. And if I made an Imperial bow, that's even slower, but it has the implicit of 24% increased elemental damage with attack skills, it'll actually be higher. And this is super important for new players. Because what if you're a new player and you've started experimenting with Path of Building, you don't fully understand what it works, but you're starting to look like, okay, well, damage go up, more damage must be better. I know I'm supposed to have 20 fuses, but you don't understand the calculation behind it, and you end up changing to this second one, which let's say it's the Imperial bow, right? And you see that, okay, I have 9.4 million damage with the Imperial bow, or I have 8.6 with a Thicket bow. However, here is where you can get tricked by things like that, because what if you actually don't have 20 stages? You actually only have 11 with that Imperial bow. So it's, oh, I would actually only have 1.5 million with that, whereas I would have 3.4. So it ends up being very, very important because this is basically like a multiplier to the damage. So if a monster has 20 explosive arrows in it, making it stage 20, it'll take so much more damage than if it only has 11 arrows in it. So a lot of people have a hard time understanding that. How do you figure out the number of fuses you have? So it's included in all my build guides. I also included in all my notes, everything like that. We have like the most detailed build guides out there. And yeah, everything is answered there, and we help people live. But the calculations for explosive arrow is basically the buff multiplier, which is 1.2 by default. And I think it's 144 if you're using malevolence, giving you some increased duration. And then it's multiplied by your number of totems and multiplied by your attack speed. So for example, what you would do is I have 6 totems. I'm using malevolence, so it's 144 buff time, and it's multiplied by my attack speed of 2.49. And we're assuming that you get 1 free arrow, because a lot of bad guides will assume that you're getting 6 free arrows if you have 6 totems. You're not, realistically, because they're not hitting a lot. So we always under calculate our damage, because the number one that I want to achieve as a content creator, I want somebody to be like, okay, I trust this guide. The numbers look pretty low, and then they play it and they're like, man, I am slaughtering everything. That's always better in my opinion than, man, this looks really good on paper. They start playing the build and they're like, oh, this does nothing. Is this supposed to be understandable? I'm already so confused. So if you're a new player, this lesson is going to be very, very rough for you. A lot of things in this lesson is like a little bit more advanced things, because Path of Exile, you're probably considered a new player even until you have 5,000 hours in the game. So Path of Exile University is generally, some of the lessons are for people that only have 1 or like between 0 to 1,000 hours, and some of the lessons are for people that have between 1 and 5,000. And if you're wondering how complicated it is, sometimes on the lessons I've been doing, we've had people with 15,000 hours in the game, like Gucci Prada's one of the best players in the game. And he's like, that's funny, I actually didn't know that. And there was one thing Steel as well didn't know, because the game changes so much and there's so much content. And like I learn from people in chat and stuff. It's such an overwhelming game. I have 25,000 hours in the game. Every league, I learn something new. Yeah. And the built-in PoE sustainable fuses is not always good. It's not always true. So you can fool yourself with programs like that. But yeah, let's see. So fun. This is the most important thing for the build, and it's a very, very big problem in gaming. I've actually been talking about it more lately, because a lot of gamers are getting to the point where they start min-maxing the fun out of the game. You see it a lot when streamers are playing new games and people are like, oh, do it this way, it's better. And they're like, bro, I'm just having fun. And like games like Path of Exile, RuneScape, etc., it's very easy to min-max the fun out of your game. This is why SSF can be a really good game mode, because now you're doing things that you're enjoying, you're doing things that you need for your character. Whereas in softcore, it's very easy to get dragged into the what makes me the most profit per hour, right? So you can raise your hand in chat if you're very easily drawn to that. Like, man, this is the most profit I can make per hour without necessarily enjoying it. So that's a very easy way to burn out. So honestly, think about that a lot. And you want to combine like, well, yeah, so many people are like, yeah, I mean, max the fun out of games. So think about, am I going to have fun with this build? Can it do everything I need it to be? Do I need a separate bosser and a mapper? Sometimes I will make separate characters where like, this is my mapping character. It fucking blasts, but it can't do bosses at all. I don't want this to ever do a boss. And then, have I done this before? Did I enjoy this in the past? Is he using mechanics that I know? And like loads of things like this. And sometimes, or very often, the build you choose as a league starter is not what you end up playing for the rest of the league. A lot of the time, what you have as a league starter will be something you play for a week or two, and particularly us SSF players will end up finding loot and then deciding what we're going to play next depending on the loot. Sometimes you'll have a really good league starter, like somebody just mentioned in chat, unless it's EA. EA has been one of the most successful things we've done, where not only is it a league starter, but it scales so well that it can do everything. And what normally happens is that a league starter can have a really low floor to be playable, right? But it has a very low ceiling. So it's like, yeah, okay, you can't really scale it past this. Whereas there might be other builds like Instacker. It's a very advanced build that uses intelligence to do damage. It could cost so much as 300, well, divines now to get started. and it would be literally unplayable on 100 or 150 divine budget, but it would be probably the strongest build in some leagues with 500 divines. So it has a very high floor and a very high ceiling. So that is definitely something you have to keep in mind when choosing your starter, is that you want it to be able to work with nothing. We're actually not ready to move to questions. We are going to start talking a little bit about layers of a build and what a build needs. So let me open the build guide one. So for those that aren't familiar with my build guides, we have loads of things in notes, and we have loads of like step-by-step things to make it easy for new players. Because the way build guides used to be before we changed it was people would just give you an in-game tree and then be like, here you go, here's what I'm doing, and good luck, new players. So it's very step-by-step now, showing you exactly what nodes to take as you're progressing. And we continue that way all the way through, as well with skills being grouped into different things, so that you don't end up using like superfluous skill gems. And I would I would advise you to never really look at older build guides as a new player, because you will not know if it's out of date or not. And so even for my own build guides, if you're a completely new player and it's just 4 months ago, don't do that. If you're an advanced player, yeah, you can probably figure out if it'll still work, if it's still good, and that can be a really good way to get a cheap and strong build. But we are making new build guides every league, so there'll be between 3 and 10 new build guides, and they're all really good and accessible. We focus on new players, but even like people that have 5,000 hours plus do end up using those. So a lot of things you want to do, you always want to be very careful about traveling. And what we mean by traveling is like these nodes are basically called travel nodes, because most builds aren't defined with their small travel nodes. Like it's just 10 decks. And there are more advanced builds that you can do, which, you stack decks and you try to get 3,000 decks or 3,000 strength or 3,000 int. They're very powerful and expensive, but you do generally on most builds want to avoid that. So sometimes you'll see a build be very focused in this small area here. It gets really, really good amounts of stuff here. And you want to be really careful of doing what we are doing in this build, which is traveling across the tree. This is actually pretty unavoidable in this build because it has things everywhere they end up needing. And there is a really, really strong feature in the game called anointments. So that is what we have in the amulet here. It allocates watchtower. So you basically get to pick one node from anywhere in the tree. We're actually picking this one. It's very important for a build. That means that on some builds, you end up dropping this entire spot, so you don't have to be anywhere near here. And features like that are really good. We'll talk a little bit about what makes this a good build. So first, let's talk about the defenses of the build and what makes it so strong. So first off, this is a champion. You can see the most important node is here. Just by default at the moment, and again, this might change later. This is more of examples of what to look out for. This gets fortification. So we're taking 20% less damage from hits from anything. And then here we're getting armor and evasion. And even the small nodes have increased armor and evasion rating. So you're getting a bunch of armor, a bunch of evasion. This is really strong, particularly in maps, right? Because there's such a large amount of monsters that are hitting you. Some people end up building around iron reflexes, just getting a large amount of armor. And that can be really, really good as well. So now we have some defenses here. And what's changed in Path of Exile the last 2 years is that you really strongly need layered defenses more than ever before. You need to deal with monsters attacking you. You need to deal with spells. You need to deal with elemental damage. And you need to be able to deal with large slams. A very important thing to understand is armor. And armor is lied about in the game. And I have a command that exclamation mark armor in my chat, but I'll read it out for you. Armor does not actually grant the percentage reduction to physical damage that the tooltip states. There is a hidden mechanic where armor only grants 10% of the armor rating as reduction in physical damage. So 25,000 armor will ever mitigate at most 2,500 HP in physical damage. I think that's the old armor before the buff, but basically what that means is armor is then amazing against a large amount of small hits, so mapping. And armor will be really bad if I'm getting like a Shaper Slam, one of the in-game bosses. If that slams our character for pure physical damage and it's hitting me for 10,000, armor can be really rough for that. And then how do we compensate for that? Well, fortification is really good for that, because if I'm taking 10,000, then this removes 2,000 right off the bat, and I'm left with 8,000 damage taking left. Then we have endurance charges. They're 4% physical mitigation per. So if I have 3 endurance charges, that's another 12, taking away another 1,200. And then if you have a bunch of this, like let's say you have a character with 10 endurance charges and fortify, now you're sitting at 60% mitigation, removing 6,000 of that damage. And then you combining that with armor, maybe you have enough armor that it is reducing 2,000. Suddenly you're left with only taking 2,000 damage from that actual initial 10,000 damage hit. And there's a way you can look at that here as well in the configuration, where here it'll say like the enemy physical damage. And you'll see this will change a lot if you have only armor as your mitigating factor. If you have 2,000 armor on your character, that can be really good against a physical hit of 500, but really bad if it was hitting you for 50,000. So this is why we want to have layered defenses. So endurance charges is great, fortify is great, and then you want to deal with spells. The default for that is now spell suppression. This is particularly strong because we don't always have good sources to deal with physical spells, because armor doesn't do anything there. And Jack in chat said incorrect math. Armor and endurance charges are additively. Yes, but that's not super important to learn for a new player. The specifics aren't super important because they're still in a very, very close ballpark. A new player isn't going to care, and you can calculate that accurately in PoB. A new player isn't going to care if they're taking 1,136 damage or 1,100. So that is less important because they're still in the same ballpark. And when Path of Exile is such a complicated game, you don't want to over-explain. Armor doesn't help with fizz spells. Sorry, doesn't help with fizz degens. Doesn't help with fizz degens. And neither does fortify. So the biggest scary thing for this build ends up being degens. And you'll see that a lot of characters will go for nodes like this. Reduce damage over time taken while you have at least 20 fortification. And that's actually one of the things that did end up killing this character. Because if you have so much tank, you'll start feeling incredibly tanky. You'll be running around on a champion and you're taking no damage from hits because you've tanked so much about it. You have, let's say you have 50,000 armor, you have 50,000 evasion, you have 100% spell suppression, you have 3 endurance charges. And then a zombie will die near you and do like a damage over time, a degen, and just poof, your life will vaporize. Because you maybe only have 10% mitigation towards this and 90% towards other things. 90% being max mitigation you can have. But yeah. And it is obviously a little complicated, but now you're hopefully starting to see the benefit of having layered defenses. And then a thing that we saw, which ended up being really important this day, was this character. Look how little life I have. I have 4,300 life. But because of the amount of layers of mitigation, this was one of the tankiest characters I had. Because I had 78 max res, and I have elemental damage reduction with half my chaos resistance. And this won't be in the game for this upcoming league, most likely. But we basically ended up having, first, things had to be, I'll give you a quick calculation. First, incoming damage. Let's say I'm taking 10,000 damage, right? And let's say, we'll walk through everything that is applicable. Let's say it's an elemental spell. So first, it's cut in half from spell suppression. I have 100% spell suppression on this build. Boom. Half of the damage is gone. Actually, we can do a bigger hit to show how impressive it is. We're taking a 40,000 damage hit. This is a huge elemental spell, and it's massive. It's cut in half. Boom. Spell suppression. Easy. Then, and it'll be, some things are a little additive, so it'll be, you can calculate this perfectly accurate in PoB. I have some videos on that too. Yeah, it's actually 53% mitigation for spell suppression, but it's going to be a little off anyway. Then 22% of the damage is going through after my resistances. We're down to 4,400 damage. And then elemental damage, yeah, it gets reduced by half of my chaos res, which is that's I'm so bad at head math. 78 divided by 2 is like 34. 34, right? 39. Okay, and see, it's a good thing I checked. I'm an idiot. 39. So then that would be multiplied by 61, I believe, of the damage is going through. I'm pretty sure I'm right. So then now we're down to 2,684 damage. And then obviously you have further things that can happen, like if it's a elemental AoE, or if it's the first time we're being hit, 8 reduced damage, or 20% chance to take 50% less area damage. You can see we can get that huge hit down to like even sub 2,000, sub 1,000. So multiple layers is very, very important. Whereas let's say that we only had 8,000 life and we only had 80% resist, then that 40,000 damage hit and 20% of the damage is going through, then we're stuck with 8,000. And if I have 7,000 life, I am dead. So it's actually, you can have some very tanky low life characters. Very tanky low life characters. So that's fun. And then for offense as well, you obviously don't have layers in the same way, but you really want to make sure. I always aim for my starter character having 1 or 2 million damage. Flasks, somebody asked about in chat, can be very, very important, but it can be hard to have uptime on flasks in boss fights. At the moment, we have things like this in Sanctum that were really cool, but we don't know if we're going to have anything like this for next league. But a lot of people like Pathfinders for that, because you can get a lot of damage from flasks. But normally, I always assume that flask is an entirely defensive thing for mapping. And obviously, you can automate flask now with the enkindling and instilling orbs. So that's sort of like a good cliff notes for what we're looking for and how we're doing a build. Obviously, very specifically, each thing is going to be so build specific. And we're going to actually, Steel might be coming over pretty soon, so we're going to wrap it up here. Obviously, there's hours and hours of stuff we could talk about here. But yeah, it's very, very build specific. That's why we make build guides. And it's going to have different scaling. That's something we're trying to work on in future build guides, is trying to make it clear, how do I scale my damage? What am I looking for as a new player? Because that ends up being the hardest thing. So I don't know if I see any like really good questions in chat in the few next seconds, I'll try to answer that. If not, we'll move on and get ready. Where are we? Vero, me, Madiki, Sai. Make build guides. Like I pay Sai to help with build guides every time. I find the hardest part about a new player going to PoE is the respec. Yeah, respec options are very bad. I think it might be good to mention fist to ally conversion of damage taken. Great thing to bring up. Thank you so much for reminding me. So sometimes a character can have pretty low armor. Like I only have 10,000 armor on this. I do have a lot more, but here it says I have 90% damage mitigation, right? But since you watched this lesson, you know that this is not true. This is a filthy liar. Because what this is estimated physical damage reduction against basically a white mob in a tier 16. If some boss comes over and is like, bunk, for 30,000 damage, it's obviously not going to have a 90% mitigation on that. So one cool thing that you can do to help with this mitigation is things like this. 15% physical damage, 13% physical damage from hits taken as cold damage. And there, our cold damage, we do have percentage physical mitigation, right? Because we've already explained that the cold mitigation, we have the 78% mitigation there and the additional mitigation here. So taking that as a different element, that can be really strong, so that we're not relying on our armor. So what we saw this league was a lot of builds were starting to focus on getting as much as 50 to 90% of physical damage taken as elemental. So for example here, I have 7% here as the implicit, taken as lightning, 8% taken as fire. I have another 13% here. And then I have things like 7% physical damage reduction here. I have a minimum endurance charge here. No matter what I do, I have at least 4% mitigation there. And converting that damage taken so that it isn't all physical helps so much. And then we have the Exarch shield as well, and that becomes very powerful. And armor is still incredibly good against the large amount of small hits you're taking. Lightning coil, really good for this, etc. Yeah. We do have to wrap it up there. So not too much time for questions there, but I hope a lot of this helped you explain some core base mechanics for PoE. Obviously, it is a bit more advanced. Yes, ailment avoidance is very important. So I hope this helped you. Exclamation mark feedback in my Twitch chat. If you do want to give feedback, we'll also take some from the comments in the YouTube video. I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks so much for watching. And if it does help you, the best thing you can do to support the stream is to tell other people who are starting the game that this is the best resource for new players. Either way, sub if you liked the video, but more importantly, try to die less than I do.